Thanks for joining us again here at Thrive in the Word. Before we get into our teaching today, I just want to say that if you didn't listen to yesterday's video, go back and listen to it because this whole thing ties in together. And we're talking about how God doesn't tempt anyone, but it's the devil that comes and it tempts us. And then we barely started in verse number 14. Because in verse number 14 of the first chapter of James, James is giving us the progress of temptation. The progress of temptation. And it's very, very important that you understand. Now, the first thing that James says, and by the way, verse number 14, but each one is tempted when he is carried away. The first step of every temptation that you will ever face, whether that's the temptation to quit, whether that's the temptation with sin. By the way, both of them are sins. To doubt is to sin. You understand? The temptation comes, and it comes in this way. It starts when you are carried away. Now, what are you carried away from? You know, one of the things that you need to do when you study the scriptures is you need to ask a lot of questions. Who, when, where, how, what? That's where I start. And then say why. Why was this said? What was the context of it? And so when we ask the why did James write this? And what's he talking about? He's talking about being carried away from God. The very first thing that the devil is going to do when we go into a time of trial and temptation, he's going to try to carry us away from our relationship with God. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt like you were too busy to read your Bible, too busy to spend time in worship, too busy to talk to God about things? You know what? Have you ever felt this? Have you ever felt that God's too busy to listen to you? That he's not listening to your person? You know what all that is? All of that is carrying you away. Have you ever felt like God's tempting you? You know what that is? That's a very dangerous doctrine, by the way, or a very dangerous teaching. That God tempts us. He puts hard times on us. That's dangerous in the fact that, you know what it does? It causes us to think that God doesn't care for us. You understand? So the very first step in sinning, the very first step in yielding to temptation is you're carried away, and you're carried away from your love relationship with God. And then James goes on, and he says in verse 14, you're carried away, and then you are enticed by his own lust. Now, what happens? We're carried away. We're moving away from our relationship with God. Then what's the next thing that happens? The next thing that happens is an enticement. Now, where does this enticement come from? It comes from our own lust. It comes from desires that we have allowed to get out of control. Now, understand this. The further you get away from God, the more you are serving yourself. Now, I haven't stopped because I forgot what I was going to say next. I want you to think about that. The further you get from God, the place that you go to is to yourself. Selfishness. And all of a sudden you're starting to think, oh, you know what? I got to have this for myself. I need this for myself. I need to have this experience, and I need to, and you know what? We as human beings, we have a lot of desires. And those desires are good. Desires for food, desires for sleep, desires for recreation, desires for rest, desires, all kinds of desires, sexual desires. Those are all desires that were given to us by God. But you know what? When we allow those desires to take God's place in our lives, you know what happens? Those desires become lust. They get out of control. And they get out of control when we leave our relationship, when we're carried away from our relationship with God. And so we get enticed. Our desires, our lusts, our out of control desires start to well up on the inside of us. And we start thinking, you know what? I deserve that. You know, I was listening one time to a pastor who had committed adultery. He had had a sexual relationship with many of the women in his church. And he said, I am just under so much pressure that I deserved. And I thought, oh my, you lost your relationship with God. You turned and you walked away from God. Now, I'm not saying the man's going to hell. I'm saying that his relationship, his fellowship with God has been gone because he thinks he needs women in order to meet his desires. You know, Jesus never said, I have no desire to eat whatsoever. Jesus didn't say that, did he? He didn't say up there on the temple, I have no desire to conquer the world. He didn't say that. What he said is, I depend upon my Father. I go to my Father. My relationship with my Father is strong. And you see, we as believers, we need to make sure that our relationship with God is strong. And that keeps us, that realization that he is God, he can do everything. He's our provider, he's our healer, he's everything that we need. He is the love of our lives. He is everything that we need. But when we are led away, and then we are enticed by our own desires, our own selfishness, you know what happens? Then sin comes, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow. But do you understand how vitally important it is for you to have a relationship, a close relationship with God? Now, let me just give you a couple keys to a close relationship with God as we prepare to close. Get into his word. Study it. Don't just read it. Study it. Dig in. Number 2, spend time in prayer. Spend time talking to the Lord. Spend time in just having conversation with him. And number 3, spend time in worship. Worship him. Fall down at his feet and worship him. And that will cause you not to be led astray by your own desires. Thank you for listening. We're going to come back again tomorrow.